let's get started. And hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I am Jie Gong from University of Hong Kong, and it's my great pleasure to host the talk today. We are very excited to have Professor Enrique Ide from IESE Business School. And Enrique's work spans I/O, Org Econ, and more recently AI. As someone who also works on AI orgs, I'm a big fan of his recent research on AI and knowledge. So today he will be presenting a new paper titled Automation, AI, and the Intergenerational Transmission of Knowledge. Just some housekeeping rules. We will have a Q&A session the last 10 minutes of this hour after his presentation. But if any of you have any clarification questions at any point, you may raise your hand digitally or type your questions in the chat. I will try to jump in and relay any questions if needed. So without any further ado, let's welcome Professor Enrique. The floor is yours.
Fantastic. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today talking about this new paper titled Automation, AI, and the Intergenerational Transmission of Knowledge. So recent advances in artificial intelligence have fueled optimistic forecasts of dramatic increases in productivity and economic growth. The reason is that unlike traditional automation, AI can perform tasks long regarded as inherently human. As a result, many technologists foresee economic transformations that could rival or even surpass that of the Industrial Revolution. However, the widespread adoption of AI may actually carry some unintended long-term cost. In particular, early evidence already suggests that by allowing senior workers to do more independently, AI could reduce entry-level opportunities. Why is this important? Because today's juniors are tomorrow's seniors, and entry-level jobs are key for transmitting tacit knowledge, which are those insights and skills that are difficult to explain and codify, and are therefore developed through repeated observations of practical successes and failures. All of these developments are raising concerns about how future generations will actually acquire essential expertise. So in this paper, I develop a model to explore how automation and AI can affect the intergenerational transmission of tacit knowledge, and with that, impact long-run economic growth. Using this model, I examine several key questions, such as how do improvements in entry-level automation affect the productivity of current and future generations? Do these technological improvements raise welfare, or can frictions and externalities render them harmful by eroding the skills of future cohorts? And third, well, if so, can other AI tools, such as AI copilots, for example, help mitigate these negative effects by assisting individuals who actually fail to acquire skills early in their careers? Now, the existing literature on automation and AI has largely focused on the immediate productivity gains or the direct labor market effects of these technologies, but has largely overlooked the critical role that interpersonal interactions play in transferring valuable workplace skills. So the idea of this paper is to address this gap by introducing automation and AI into a growth model of knowledge diffusion. Specifically, I'm going to be analyzing an overlapping generation model with two cohorts where novices, which are the younger generation, learn from experts, which are the older generation. So what do I find? Just a brief preview of the result. First, the tacit nature involved in the novice-expert interactions is going to render these relationships contractually incomplete, which is then going to lead to socially excessive automation of early career tasks. Second, I also show that improvements in entry-level automation generate an intergenerational trade-off. They immediately raise the income and productivity of the current generation of experts, but may weaken the skills of future generations, harming growth. This is sometimes enough to actually reduce overall welfare. However, this trade-off between current and future generations does not arise for all technological advances. Okay? In particular, it does not arise in the case of improvements in routine labor augmenting technologies. And here you can think about algorithms or machines that can help juniors avoid mistakes. So why are these results important? Because first, they imply that some dimensions of automation and AI can actually harm growth. And second, because they mean that we need to be careful when interpreting the data. Specifically, not all initial or short-run productivity gains are created equal. Some come at the expense of future productivity gains, while others actually reinforce future productivity gains. Using the model, I then conduct simple back-of-the-envelope calculations on the potential long-run losses of AI-driven entry-level automation. And I show that automating, say, 5% of entry-level tasks could lead to a decline of 0.05 percentage points in the annual US growth rate of per capita output, while automating a larger share, say 30%, would lead to a larger decline of 0.35 percentage points per year. Now, just a brief disclaimer here, this is not a forecast. It is simply an attempt to gauge or illustrate the potential magnitude of this narrow entry-level automation channel. In particular, and this is just an example, these calculations abstract from the potential effect that AI could have in increasing the innovation rate. I then benchmark these long-run losses that I just showed you, comparing them with some short-run forecast of one-time productivity gains from AI adoption. And the idea here is to get a sense of that intergenerational trade-off that I showed you before. And I also consider the case in which these disruptions on the entry-level job markets are temporary. So they last for one generation, say 20 years, because, for example, firms are able to reintroduce new junior tasks after an initial period of displacement. And finally, in the third part of the paper, I explore the effect of another dimension of AI, which is the effects of AI copilots. So what are these copilots? These are systems that offer access to expertise that was previously attainable only through extensive hands-on experience. I show, basically very intuitively, that this, and according to intuition, that these AI copilots can partially mitigate the negative effects of entry-level automation. And the idea here is very simple. If you weren't able to acquire the skills, adequate skills as a junior, then the system can help you out when you become a low-skill expert in the future. However, more surprisingly, I show that the introduction of these systems are not always beneficial because they may inadvertently diminish the incentives of younger workers to invest in hands-on learning. So just to put it a little bit differently, if improvements in entry-level automation reduces expert supply of apprenticeship-like arrangements, it's kind of a negative supply shock in apprenticeships. The introduction of these AI copilots reduces novices' demand for such arrangements. So this is kind of a negative demand shock. So what is going to be the outline for today? Given the available time, I am going to first introduce the baseline model, which focuses on entry-level automation. I'm going to characterize the long-run outcomes and the effect of a one-time improvement in automation in this model. Third, then I'm going to explain you how I conduct my simple back-of-the-envelope calculations, and then I'm going to conclude. So this means that please, you have to see the paper. Please see the paper for the theoretical analysis of AI copilots. Okay? So let's begin with the model. Time is discrete and infinite, indexed by t. In each period, there are two overlapping generations, novices and experts. An individual spends one period as a novice, then one period as an expert before retiring. Each cohort has a unit mass, and there's no population growth. Now, novices are going to be born identical and without wealth, while experts, in contrast, are going to be heterogeneous in terms of skills. Specifically, expert I at time t is going to have a skill level QIT, which is going to distribute according to a Fréchet distribution with a scale parameter KT, shape parameter 1 divided by theta, and location parameter Qmin. Now, from here on, I'm going to be referring to KT, that is the scale of the Fréchet distribution of expert skills, as society's stock of tacit knowledge. Why? Because a higher KT actually shifts the entire distribution of expert skills to the right in a first-order stochastic dominant sense. And moreover, as I'm going to show you in a couple of slides, KT is actually endogenous. It is going to depend on expert experiences as novices in the previous period. Now, there's a single final good, which I'm going to use as a numerary. Experts, moreover, are going to be in charge of production. The output produced by an expert is then going to be equal to her skill, provided that a continuum of routine tasks with total measure n greater than 1 are executed. These routine tasks can either be performed by novices or machines. For simplicity, I don't allow experts to do these routine tasks themselves. The total cost faced by expert I at time t is then C of LIT, where LIT is the measure of task this expert assigned to novices, and therefore N minus LIT is the measure of task this expert assigns to machines. That is the reason why this first expression that I show you in the slide here is the total wage bill incurred by the expert, and this over here is going to be the total machine cost, where RT is the rental rate of machines. Now, in addition to these two costs, I'm also going to assume that the expert here incurs a cost in supervising novices. You can think about this as basically supervising, assisting, and correcting for novices' mistakes. If you want to, you can also add a cost of supervising machines, but adding it to the model just complicates the math without adding any additional insight. However, an important assumption that I'm making here, that I want to make very explicit now, is that I'm actually assuming that novices cannot identify or select experts based on skills. Where do you see this assumption here? In the fact that the wage does not depend on the skill of the expert. So basically, all experts are going to pay the same wages. I'm going to discuss this assumption at the end of the theoretical model, say 20 to 25 minutes from now. Okay? Additionally, following Acemoglu, Kong, and Restrepo, I'm going to assume that each machine is produced instantaneously using raw units of the final good and fully depreciates after one period. This immediately implies that the rental rate of machines is going to be equal to raw forever. Why do I make this assumption? Because it allows me to abstract from the dynamics of capital accumulation in order to focus on the dynamics of knowledge accumulation. Now, experts are going to try to optimize their income in their final period of their economic life. I'm going to assume that the parameters are such that even the lowest skill expert produces. The solution to this problem then gives rise to the individual demand for novice labor of this particular expert, which is given by equation 1 here in the slides. This individual demand for novice labor is very intuitive. It simply says that, well, if machines are cheaper than novices, then the expert is going to assign all tasks to machines, none to novices. Conversely, if novices are significantly more cheaper than machines, then the expert is going to assign all tasks to machines and none to novices. All tasks to novices, none to machines. And in between, the expert is going to split the tasks between novices and machines to economize between labor cost, machine cost, and supervision cost. Now, a key simplifying property of this individual demand that you can see here in the slide is that it actually does not depend on the skill of the expert. So we have skill-independent hiring. All experts want to hire the same amount of novices. Okay, this is a key simplifying property that is going to make my life very simple and quite tractable. But I will return again I'm going to discuss this assumption in more detail in 20 to 25 minutes at the end of the theoretical model. Because all experts are going to hire the same amount of novices, and there's a unit mass of them, this individual demand is also going to be the aggregate demand of novice labor in the model. Okay? What about the supply? Well, the novice is going to choose her labor supply to maximize her expected lifetime income, where this first term over here is the income of this individual as a novice. The second term is going to be the utility of labor as a novice. And this third term is the expected income of this novice as an expert tomorrow. This expected income is going to depend on the amount of labor this novice supplies, because I'm going to assume that each task allows the novice to interact with a randomly matched expert whose skill she's able to observe and assimilate. In addition, after this learning period, but before becoming an expert, the novice is also going to attempt innovation by generating a new idea whose quality is random and also distributed fréchette. The quality of these ideas is also going to depend on the current stock of tacit knowledge, reflecting the fact that better ideas are more likely to arise in more knowledgeable societies, where this parameter nu here, which is greater than or equal to 0, captures novices' capacity for innovation. All of this implies that the novice's skill upon becoming an expert tomorrow isn't going to be equal to the highest skill among the experts she meets and her own generated idea. Because each expert then requires the same amount of novice labor, require that basically we had a skill-independent, skill-unbiased hiring, then each encounter of the novice with an expert represents an independent draw of the current distribution of expert skills. Moreover, since the idea quality is also independently distributed fréchette, I have that the expert skill, the novice's skill upon becoming an expert tomorrow, conditional on the amount of labor she supplies today, is also going to be distributed fréchette, but with a different scale, which is going to depend on the current stock of tacit knowledge, because that basically captures how good are experts that I'm trying to learn now, the amount of labor this novice supplies, LT, and this parameter nu, which captures novice's capacity for innovation. Consequently, the problem faced by a novice today at time t can be written as equation 2 in the slides. The solution to this problem then gives rise to the aggregate supply of novice labor. Why? Because all novices are identical and there's a unit mass of them. An important property of this aggregate supply is that it is increasing in the current stock of tacit knowledge. So basically, the more knowledgeable are current experts, the more willing are novices to supply labor to learn from them. Put differently, novices may be willing to accept lower wages if compensated through valuable learning opportunities. That is, the model gives rise to this apprenticeship-like arrangement. However, recall that novices are born without wealth. Moreover, I am going to assume that they cannot borrow because the tacit knowledge that they seek from experts cannot be used as collateral. All of this implies that wages cannot fall below zero, or put differently, novices cannot pay upfront for training. Now, let capital LT star be the equilibrium amount of novice labor at T. In the model, this is equivalent to the number of novices per expert. If the market fails to clear at non-negative wages, simply assume proportional rationing. In equilibrium, then, the growth rate of knowledge is going to be given by equation 3 in the slides. Aggregate output is then going to be equal to the average skills of expert. So it is easy to show that the growth rate of output is approximately proportional to the growth rate of knowledge. So in this economy grows because the economy becomes more knowledgeable, and knowledge here increases either because novices learn from experts, and therefore the best practices diffuse from experts into novices, or because novices attempt innovation by themselves. Finally, overall welfare at time t is going to be simply equal to the discounted sum of the income of novices plus experts minus the cost of machines and the disutility of novice labor. Now, before heading into the results, let me just give you a brief remark on interpretation. The model that I just showed you is actually agnostic regarding whether the routine tasks involve codifiable or non-codifiable knowledge. The key feature of this task is that they are entry-level and they are therefore bounded in complexity. They do not require significant prior experience. For an example of entry-level routine tasks involving codifiable knowledge, we can think about the Da Vinci surgical system, which is a robotic surgeon that does control incision and suturing, tasks that were 10 years ago done by resident surgeons. For an example of a routine entry-level task requiring non-codifiable knowledge, we can think about document review and initial contract drafting in law. These are tasks that are not easy to basically summarize in a series of steps, and that again, 10 years ago, they were mostly done by junior lawyers, but now they're increasingly being automated thanks to recent advances in artificial intelligence. So why is this important? Because it implies that the model that I just showed you applies broadly to automation, not just to AI. Okay? However, the Copilot extension is specifically about AI. However, I do believe that the insights of this baseline model, which focuses on entry-level automation, do indeed hold particular relevance to AI, given AI's distinctive ability to automate a wide and expanding range of tasks, particularly at the entry level, as I'm going to discuss in a couple of minutes. In contrast, expert skills here in the model represent deeply experiential, non-codifiable knowledge. So if we go back to the surgery example before, you can think about experts here as attending surgeons, managing unforeseen complications or unexpected anatomical variations. Or in the case of law, you can think about senior partners conducting sophisticated legal analysis or engaging in complex settlement negotiations. So with that, I will now, let's go to the result, and I will begin by characterizing the long-run equilibrium outcomes of this economy. For simplicity, I'm going to do it graphically. So on the x-axis, what you're going to see is rho, which is the cost of machines. While on the y-axis, you're going to see K0, which is the initial stock of tacit knowledge in this society. How knowledgeable is the first generation of experts? The first result states that, well, if machines are super, super cheap, then the economy necessarily converges to what I call the learning breakdown regime. In this regime, there is no knowledge nor output growth in the long run, and in fact, output converges to the minimum skill level. What is the intuition here? Well, even at zero wages, experts do not allocate enough tasks to novices, and moreover, there's not enough novice innovation to sustain knowledge accumulation. As a result, knowledge inexorably decreases over time, and we end up in a stagnation. Things get more interesting when machines become a little bit more expensive in this intermediate region that I'm highlighting here in the slides. In this case, the long-run outcome is going to depend on whether the initial stock of tacit knowledge is above or below this cutoff K dagger of rho, which I'm plotting here in the graph. If it is below, then again, we're going to converge to the learning breakdown regime. If it is above, in contrast, we're going to converge to what I call the constrained learning regime, which is a regime in which there's a strictly positive knowledge and output growth in the long run, but machines are going to remain inefficient in use, which is going to limit novice-expert interaction and therefore growth. So what is the intuition here? Well, suppose that the initial stock of tacit knowledge is above this cutoff, then this means that the first generation of experts is very knowledgeable, and therefore the first generation of novices are very willing to work for very low wages to learn from this very knowledgeable generation of experts. As a result, the first generation of experts is going to hire a lot of novices. These novices are therefore going to learn a lot, and they're going to become very high-skill experts tomorrow. But if so, then tomorrow novices are going to be willing to work for even lower wages, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. So we end up in this virtuous cycle that leads to knowledge accumulation over time. Eventually, however, wages are going to hit the zero lower bound. At that point, novices would be willing to pay experts to displace machine and allow them to learn more, but they can't because they don't have initial wealth and they cannot borrow due to the tacit nature of the knowledge involved. That is the reason why machines are going to remain inefficient in use, which is going to limit the growth of knowledge and output. And that is why I call this the constrained learning regime. In contrast, if the initial stock of tacit knowledge is below this cutoff K dagger, then the first generation of experts is not very knowledgeable, and therefore the first generation of novices is going to demand relatively higher wages to work for them. But if so, the first generation of experts are only going to hire fewer novices, so novices are not going to learn much, and therefore tomorrow novices are going to demand even higher wages, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. And again, we end up in this negative cycle that lead us to the learning breakdown regime once again. Finally, when machines become sufficiently expensive, the economy converges to what I called the full learning regime. This is very similar to the constrained learning regime, except that when we reach the zero lower bound of wages, machines are so expensive that experts are only going to hire novices. And that is the reason why we have maximal knowledge transmission and growth. So having characterized basically the steady states, the potential steady states of this economy, let me show you what happens when we have a one-time improvement in automation. So consider an economy that at time tau minus 1 is either in the full learning or in the constrained learning regime. So this is an economy that it is growing over time. At the start of period tau, there's an automation improvement, which I'm going to model as a reduction in the cost of machines. The cost of machines are going to permanently fall from rho to a lower level rho prime. The question here is what happens with the income of current and future experts and with society's overall welfare? Again, I'm going to show it to you graphically. So what you are going to see in the slides is the evolution of the aggregate income of experts as a function of time in the case in which there's no automation improvement, there's no shock. Here, the prices of machines are always equal to 1.2. Okay? Now, in period tau here, we're going to introduce this shock, machines are going to fall in price from 1.2 to 1.05, and what you're going to see is an immediate increase in the income of the current generation of experts. Why? Because these experts have now become more productive. They can produce the same amount of output, but at a lower cost. However, these gains do come at the expense of future generations. Why? Because this improvement is going to reduce novice expert interaction, making future generation less skilled. And therefore, from there on, the income of the future generation of experts is going to grow more slowly. As I show in the paper, because the equilibrium is inefficient, because we have this contractual friction, in some circumstances, this shock can actually reduce overall welfare. Something that cannot happen in the planner solution, in the first best, where an improvement in automation always, weekly at least, increases welfare. Now, there's no macro studies, but this result is actually consistent with evidence from finance and medicine, where the skills of juniors have deteriorated following the adoption of automated financial tools and robotic surgical systems. This is vividly illustrated by being in a conversation with a chief surgeon when asked about the performance of new surgeons. And basically the surgeon said, I mean, these guys can do it. They haven't had any experience doing it. Importantly, however, this trade-off between future and current generations do not arise in the case of improvements of routine labor augmenting technology. Recall, though, that these are basically machines or algorithms that can help novices avoid mistakes. In the model, this can be modeled by a reduction in the supervision cost C. So what happens here? Well, again, here is the depiction of the aggregate income of experts as a function of time. What you're going to see is if we have an improvement in routine labor augmented technology, if we have this reduction in C, then the current generation of experts are going to see an increase in income. Again, they can produce the same amount of output at a lower cost. But now they are actually going to hire more novices, and therefore the best practices from expert to novices are going to diffuse more quickly. And this is going to increase the growth rate of productivity. It is going to increase the rate at which the income of future experts grows. Unfortunately, early evidence appeared to suggest that firms view at least current iterations of generative AI mainly as a tool for entry-level automation rather than augmentation. And here the evidence comes from the excellent papers by Berger and co-authors, Bryn Jobson and co-authors, and Hosseini and Lichtinger, which I think you had a couple of weeks ago. Okay. Now, before heading into the quantitative exercise, let me just give you a brief remark on robustness. The model that I just showed you is very tractable due to the combination of 4 assumptions. The first is that expert skills are unobservable, ex ante, so all experts are going to pay the same wages. The second is that the production function is such that we have a skill-independent hiring. Basically, all experts want to hire the same amount of novices, irrespective of their skills. Third, we have proportional rationing. And fourth, we have that the initial generation of expert skills is distributed freshet. The combination of these 4 assumptions make the model tractable because it implies that expert skills are going to be freshet over time. Basically, it implies that the freshet structure of expert skill is preserved over time. And why this simplifies matters, because now we only have to keep track of a single state variable, the scale of the freshet distribution, rather than the shape of the entire distribution over time. However, as I show in the online appendix of the paper, each of these assumptions can be relaxed, though at the cost of significant complexity. More strikingly, in all these extensions, one obtains that output growth asymptotically converges to the exact same equation as in the baseline model. Hence, the results not only hold qualitatively in these model variants, but also quantitatively. This is going to be important for the quantitative exercise that follows. So any questions, burning questions so far before I head to the quantitative exercise? No? Good, fantastic. So to illustrate the potential cost highlighted by the previous analysis, I'm going to conduct simple back-of-the-envelope calculations informed by recent debates on the potential impact of generative AI. Again, let me repeat that this is not a formal calibration and it is not a forecast. Instead, its aim is to illustrate how AI-driven entry-level automation may harm long-run growth due to this narrow entry-level automation channel. Moreover, the exercise that I'm going to show you relies on a minimal set of assumptions that are fully consistent but do not require the full structure of the baseline model. Specifically, I only need to assume, first, that we have this overlapping generation structure. So each generation participates in the economy for exactly 2 OLG periods, first as novices, then as experts. And second, the second assumption is that in a steady state, the asymptotic growth rate of per capita output is given by equation 4, which is the exact same equation that in the baseline model, where L star here is the measure of tasks carried out by novices. As I mentioned before, this is consistent with several model variants, not only the baseline model that I showed you before. Now, with this in mind, suppose that AI leads to the automation of a fraction A of tasks that were previously executed by novices. The annual steady-state growth rate of output pre and post-shock, so pre-shock is going to be given by this expression over here, while post-shock it is going to be given by this other expression. This is in annual terms, where capital T here is the number of years individuals spend in each career state, first as novices, then as experts. This implies that the reduction in the steady-state growth rate of per capita output, expressed in percentage points per year, is given by equation 5 in the slides, where X here is the fraction of a steady-state growth rate that comes from learning, from novices learning the best practices from experts, while 1 minus X is the fraction of a steady-state growth rate that comes due to novice innovation, due to new ideas. Hence, for my calculations, I only need 5 pieces of information. First, I need the number of years each individual spent in each career state, T. This one, I'm going to set it to 20. So basically, individuals are going to spend 20 years, say 25 to 45 as novices, and 20 years as experts, say 45 to 65. Second, I need the annual growth rate of per capita output prior to the automation shock, G. I'm going to set this one to 2%, reflecting the average per capita growth, the average growth rate of annual growth rate of per capita output in the United States during the last 150 years. Third, I need a plausible value for the parameter theta. This one, I'm going to set it to 0.5, but I'm also going to consider the case in which it's equal to 0.28. Where do these values come from? Well, theta 0.5 comes from Lucas, who in a paper in 2009 calibrated this parameter to match the distribution, the income distribution for the United States. This value 0.28, in contrast, comes from a different calibration done by Caicedo, Lucas, and Rossi Hansberg in a more recent paper in 2019, I think. Fourth, I need the fraction of growth that comes from learning or the diffusion of best practices, which is X. This one, I'm going to set it to 65% with robustness checks at 50 and 80%. Where do this 65% comes from? It comes from the trade literature. So in a paper a couple of years ago, Itom and Kortum showed that around 40% of TFP growth in the United States come from the diffusion of the best ideas from abroad. Santa Cruz, in a more recent paper, is more conservative and found that that number is actually 25% for developed economies. So I'm going to take the midpoint between 25 and 40, and I'm going to double it, and that gives me 65, because I want to account not only for the international diffusion, but also for domestic diffusion, okay? But still, I'm going to consider 50 and 80% as robustness checks. And finally, I need the fraction of entry-level tasks that are automated due to AI, A. Here, I'm going to consider 2 cases, A 5% and A 30%. These are inspired by recent papers by Acemoglu and Agyon and Bunel. Now, just a brief disclaimer. These papers by Acemoglu and Agyon and Buller are agnostic regarding whether AI actually would lead to automation or augmentation. So they don't specify that in the model, but here, because I'm focusing on entry-level automation, I'm going to assume that these are actually task automated. So what do I find? So let me plug the numbers. And first, I'm going to show you what I consider the baseline case, which is X 65% and theta 0.5. And what you see here is that automating 5% of entry-level tasks would lead to a decline of approximately 0.05 percentage points in the annual growth rate of the US per capita output. While automating a larger share leads to a 30%, leads to a larger decline of 0.35 percentage points. Now, for robustness, what happens here is that as you increase X, then the losses become more prominent. So, for example, in the case A, 5%, if you move from X65 to X80%, then the losses go from 0.05 percentage points to 0.08 percentage points. And this is quite intuitive because when we assume a higher X, we are implicitly attributing a larger fraction of growth coming from learning, which is the exact same channel that it is disrupted by this improvement in entry-level automation. And the same happens when you increase theta. So losses here, the back of the envelope calculation losses, increases with theta. And the intuition is more or less the same here. What happens is that when you increase theta, the model is attributing a larger share of growth to learning rather than innovation. Okay? So any questions so far? No? Good. So now, these are all fine numbers, but I also want to get a sense of the intergenerational transmission, the intergenerational trade-off that I mentioned before. So in order to do this, I'm going to combine these long-run losses with some short-run forecast of one-time productivity gains from AI adoption. Okay? In particular, in this recent paper that I mentioned before, Acemoglu estimate forecast that AI could lead to a one-time increase in TFP in 10 years of 0.71% if AI affects 5% of tasks. Okay? In contrast, Ion and Bunel are more optimistic. They're more aggressive. They think that AI will actually affect 30% of tasks, but that would also lead to a one-time increase in TFP in 10 years by 7% instead of 0.71%. Now, there's a small issue here, which is that the baseline model that I showed you before models improvements in automation as reduction in machine cost, not increases in TFP growth. Okay, so put differently, I need to find a way to put these estimates from Ion and Bunel into one of my different model variants in an internally consistent way. So what I'm going to do is that I'm slightly going to change. I'm going to use one of the variants that it is developed in the online appendix. Okay? And the idea here is to put everything into one internally consistent framework. So let me explain how I do it. And this is going to be the last part of results, and then I'm going to conclude. Okay? So as I mentioned before, I'm going to slightly change the production function. In particular, the production function of the baseline model is a special case of this more general formulation that you're seeing here in the slides, okay? Where these gamma terms over here capture the productivity of novices in the different tasks. S here is indexing tasks. And A, which is an indicator variable, goes 0, 1, indicates whether task S is assigned to novices or whether task S is assigned to machines. The baseline model corresponds to the case in which novices and machines are equally productive in all tasks, and both are normalized without loss of generality to 1. In that case, the individual A's do not matter. The only thing that matters is the share of tasks done by novices or machines. Okay? Suppose instead that novices can complete all routine tasks at productivity H. Okay? And in contrast, machines can only perform a strict subset of the N tasks, but at a much higher productivity M. Okay? Then, in this case, as I show in the paper, all experts are going to try to automate all feasible tasks. An aggregate output is going to take this very simple Cobb-Douglas form, where QT bar is the same value as before, is the average expert skill as before. And this is a new term that it is capturing here the different productivities and the extent of automation of routine tasks. So what is going to happen here is that an improvement in automation is going to increase this new term, but it is going to affect the growth rate of the average expert skill over time. So that's how we're going to put everything into the same framework. Specifically, If AI enables the profitable automation of A start tasks that were previously done by novices at a much higher productivity, M of AI greater than H, then the immediate one-off productivity gains at time t take this expression over here. Okay? And these are, in fact, the gains estimated by Acemoglu and Achenan-Bunel. In fact, their methodology is a little bit more complex, but in essence, this is what they're actually doing. So with that in mind, following these two papers, I'm going to assume that AI, that this automation shock, occurs in 2035, 10 years from now, and I'm going to trace its consequences using my overlapping generation framework. And in particular, I'm going to calculate the ratio of output with the shock and the output without the shock in 2025, today, and therefore there's no shock, so they both must coincide. And then at 2035, 2055, 2075. Why? Because I'm assuming here that each generation, each individual spends 20 years in each career status. Okay? This implies, if you follow the math, that this is the formula for the ratio from 2035 from there on. Okay? And then I'm going to interpolate smoothly using MATLAB's interp function using piece-chip method. Okay, so this is simply for you. So my idea is not to give you the definitive answer. My idea is to be as transparent as possible so that if you don't agree with my numbers, you can go and plug it and create your own scenario, so to speak. So what do I find? So these are the results. So what you see here is that in both the scenarios, the initial gains of AI adoption fade in less than 20 years. In the baseline scenario where X is 65% and theta is 0.5. Okay? In Acemoglu, if we believe the Acemoglu scenario, then the initial gains are going to be dissipated by 2050, in 15 years, by the loss of tacit knowledge, with output following before the no AI baseline by 2% after 50 years, in 2085. Okay? In the more aggressive Achenan-Bunel scenario, the initial gains are going to fade in exactly 20 years, by 2055. And in this case, however, because the transmission of knowledge is more disrupted, then and it is affecting the growth rate, then output is going to fall more significantly relative to the no AI baseline, and is going to, in 50 years, is going to be basically 10% smaller in 2085. Now, these results imply that even a temporary 20-year disruption in the entry-level job market is sufficient to erase the adoption gains in this baseline case that I'm considering. And you can think about this scenario that this would happen if firms eventually reintroduce junior tasks after a period of initial displacement. In this case, however, you don't have an effect, the AI shock here does not have an effect on the growth rate of output. So both the TFP growth and the disruption of the tacit knowledge are both going to have level effects. But if you follow the calculations, then basically in the baseline scenario, both net themselves after 20 years. Okay? Now you can be more pessimistic or you can be more optimistic, and basically it's going to depend on that. Okay? So final remarks. Now to conclude, let me step back a little bit from the details of the math and from the details of the model to highlight what I believe are the key lessons and ideas of this paper. So, in essence, this paper advances three ideas. First, early career jobs play a key role in the transmission of tacit knowledge. Second, the tacit knowledge involved in these entry career jobs is going to render these relationships contractually incomplete, which is going to result in underinvestment in learning. And third, AI is a new technology that has the potential to automate a broad new range of tasks, particularly those performed by novices. And as the evidence is already suggesting, it's kind of early, but the evidence is already suggesting. All of this implies that it is likely that we are going to have socially excessive automation of entry-level work, which can raise short-term productivity, but harm. I'm not going to say that the economy is going to shrink, but it's going to reduce long-run growth. So that is kind of the big takeaway. Now, from a methodological perspective, I think that the contribution of this paper is to provide a framework to start thinking about how new technologies affect the transmission of this tacit knowledge across generation. So remember, AI has many dimensions. Entry-level automation is one of them, but it can actually maybe help novices avoid mistake, and that is going to reinforce things. Maybe copilots are going to help us in a different way. Maybe AI is going to increase the innovation rate. It's going to allow novices to be more creative. The paper here offers a blueprint to try to incorporate those dimensions and to start thinking about those ideas. And finally, from a policy, the paper has some, I believe, interesting policy implications. First, a disclaimer, I believe that the correct policy experiment is not AI versus no AI. So that is good to create to basically show you this intergenerational trade-off in a very blunt way. But the correct policy experiment, rather, I believe it is how to fully harness AI's potential. Okay? And for the issues analyzed in this paper, and therefore we have to fix this, or we have to help fix this friction that it is arising due to contractual frictions at the entry level. So for that, some potential remedies include subsidies for mentorship and training programs at the entry level, maybe taxing entry-level automation, incentivize the development of AI systems designed to complement rather than replace juniors, because those are actually going to reinforce future productivity gains. And for educational institutions, like the one some of us belong, these institutions could try to help young individuals to acquire more tacit skills before formally entering into the labor market. So maybe we have to shift a little bit the emphasis out of codifiable knowledge, and maybe in the last year of undergrad and so forth, put more emphasis on developing more internships, or maybe we could try to use the same technology, AI, to create new simulations in order for these individuals to try to get more experience before formally entering into the labor market, and because then we end up in this type of contractual frictions. And with that, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Fantastic, fantastic talk and fantastic time management. So on the last point you raised, I think I couldn't agree more. Your co-author Edward Telemann, when he visiting HKU, and we had a conversation about, like, say, now the first and second year lawyers in law firms are much replaced by AI. The question is, like, how can it become, like, where do we get the third year lawyers? And then we actually basically touch upon the issue you mentioned. Basically, I think we have the responsibility to provide some of the training or tacit knowledge before they in fact enter the labor market. So I find it very fascinating to see this model illustrate this long-term trade-offs. So now let's open the floor for our audience to see if anyone has any questions. You can just unmute yourself and directly ask.
Hi, Enrique. So this is Lian from Toronto. So a great talk. I probably need to leave early. I have to teach. So this is a really great talk. It's a nice framework. I just have a small thought. I think you model the AI, how AI affects the novice, the labor, and the AI maybe the impact can be multidimensional. Might also affect the senior people. So maybe the entrepreneur, so how the distribution of Q, maybe the shape parameter theta, right? The theta parameter might also be affected. So I think about how it's more like a multiple perspective. How to think about this AI affect all the dimensions and then affect the distribution and the economic growth rate, the income distribution. It's really depend on how you model that. I think here you model the entry level. So it can be also be the senior level. So like the parameter theta thing in your model, it's a nice framework that can incorporate all these kind of things very, I think, in a very easy ways. Or so you think of the co-pilot, something like that. So I just want to think about this multi-perspective, and your framework is very flexible, incorporate all of them. It might be when you do the calibration, all these kind of things, it really depends on how you model that, how you model AI. Yes, that's my thought. It's nice, good framework. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. So I tried to go a little bit in that direction in the part of the paper that I wasn't able to show because of I wanted to be on time. So in the third part of the paper, I explore the effects of these AI copilots. Okay, and the idea here is that, well, yes, suppose that AI disrupts, doesn't allow the lawyers here to acquire the first, so it automates entry-level tasks, and therefore it affects the skills of junior lawyers. And therefore, and the question here was where do we get the third-year lawyers? Remember? So one potential counter argument to that is, well, maybe you don't need this skill because if AI over there, if when you become a third-year lawyer, AI can help you out, then it doesn't mean, I mean, we didn't lose much, okay? And that is in some sense what these extensions of the AI copilots are trying to capture. So let me tell you informally how I model it. Basically, I said, now in the model, now experts have the potential to ask for help if they don't have enough skills. So that is going to start affecting the distribution of expert skills, so to speak. And what you see here is that this AI copilot can indeed partially mitigate this negative effect, and this is the first order intuition, right? However, the interesting part is that at the same time, they're going to reduce even more the incentives of novices now to learn. And that is kind of the more surprising part. So I agree, AI is a very big technology that has a lot of applications. The the baseline model focuses on entry-level automation because I think it is the more pressing issue, and it starts building this extension to start exploring these other potential avenues. Copilots is one. The other one could very well be that AI can help you increase innovation. I mean, it can help novices develop their own skills by talking to ChatGPT or think about their own ideas. We could model, that is not endogenous in my model, but that is captured in some sense to the parameter new here. So I don't know. I mean, thank you for the comment. I hope that this framework opens up the appetite to start tweaking the model. I know these dimensions, and we can get a complete picture. So I agree. This is, by any chance, by any means, this is not the final word. But I agree. Thank you.
Great. More questions? Actually, I have one question about, I have
Perfect.
multiple questions, but let me start. So one thought is about the way that novice match with the expert. I think in the model you assume random matching. Is that how it
Yes.
works? Yeah,
Yes.
so I understand why you do that. And I'm just imagine like what's your view on whether there are other ways, or I would say, what is the more efficient ways to transform knowledge? Because I myself also like do empirical work like within organizations, how like cross generations we pass on the tacit knowledge from expert to young workers. And I ask so because fundamentally important, and also I think AI may change the way we transmit such knowledge. I want to hear your view about this.
So two comments. I'm going to answer in two ways. First, I'm going to answer through the model, and then I'm going to answer the big pictures.
Right.
So I agree. The model, because you have this skill independent hiring, then you have random matching between novices and experts. In the line appendix, I develop a model in which the skills of experts is perfectly observable ex ante, but you still need to work with them to actually acquire it. In that model, you're going to have endogenous matching, right? And what I see is that as long as you have this zero lower bound on wages, the output is going to still converge asymptotically to this expression over here. So the random matching assumption is not essential, with some qualifications, okay? Like, let me put it differently. assuming observability of expert skills is going to affect the basing of attraction of the different long-run outcomes. But conditional on growth, we're going to reach the same equation. And for the quantitative exercise, that makes me happy because we kind of know, and the quantitative exercise shows that we are going to still grow. So it is not affecting the basing of attraction, it is affecting the growth rate in the long run. So from a robustness perspective, now more big picture. So in the paper, I do discuss very briefly that AI, for example, could help novices understand experts better. So it is not only that it cannot help you become more productive. It cannot help, so it can help you become more innovative. And at the same time, it can help you understand better what experts are telling you.
Like a
I don't
tutor.
know. Exactly. I don't know how to model it yet, but I discuss it briefly as a possibility that I'm not considering. Now, one thing though that it is important is that, so remember this, so we have evidence that in medicine, when you introduce this Da Vinci surgical system, this robotic surgeon, it is not that this diminish the slots of resident surgeons. Resident surgeons were still there, right? It is now in the model that doesn't happen. Resident surgeons were still there, but the thing is that having this machine there was so attractive that the attending surgeon basically sent the resident surgeons up to the corner, and therefore they weren't able to interact with the patient, and you end up with the same result. So in the model, you see this as a reduction in the amount of, so you can think about it as experts do not hiring as much, but even if you continue hiring, but if you don't empower them, then you're going to have the same problem. So I agree, it would be interesting to, this is a macro model, so to speak. It would be interesting to open up the organization and model this process a little bit more, model it more in detail. But anything that we try to model, I think it has to capture the fact that even if everybody's on the room, you need to be participating, you need to be discussing, you need to be interacting, you need to be failing a little bit and succeeding at the same time for this process, for this knowledge to go from the expert towards the novice. So that's my 2 cents. I don't have anything more smart or interesting
it's
to say.
sufficiently clear for me. Thank you. We probably have time for one more question. Anyone? Okay, if not, I'm going to abuse my power. Sorry, one more question for you. I really like this. Is there anything you can say about the distribution? I mean, we
The
care about the level
distribution.
of knowledge. We care about the level. I think your result speaks a lot about the level, but how about the distribution of knowledge among the population? Because I mean, people talk a lot about the distributional effects of AI, like equalizer versus enlarge the gap. So does your model speaks to distribution?
So good. Yes. So yes, but not very interestingly. Let me put it differently. I mean, I don't know. So I have a previous paper, the paper that Eduard presented, where we have very interesting and new results regarding inequality. So in that paper, we show, using the knowledge hierarchies framework, that the autonomous AI leads to higher output but more inequality. Non-autonomous AI, which are these AI copilots, lead to less inequality but lower output. Now, in the model, in this particular model, you can talk about inequality. The only issue is that I don't know if it is a bug or a feature, but the problem is that in general, when you have this learning process, you always end up in some way converging to a Fréchet distribution. Like, for example, I have another extension in the align appendix where I don't impose the Fréchet distribution, but in the long run, you end up in the Fréchet distribution. Why? Because from a very big theorem, a very strong theorem on extreme value theory. And what is the issue with that? Or maybe it's a bug of a feature, I'm not entirely sure, is that in the Fréchet distribution, whenever the scale is greater, the variance of the distribution is going to be greater. And therefore, more knowledgeable societies are going to be more unequal by construction, so to speak. So, and how unequal? Well, it's going to depend on this parameter theta as well, because this parameter theta, it is going to capture the tail, the upper tail of the distribution. And so, but the problem there is that you have to, in order to say something a little bit more interesting, now you have to, as your colleague was saying, create a theory about how AI could impact theta. And I'm not entirely sure still how to do that, but it is an excellent question.
Great, thank you. Any other comments or questions from the audience? Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Enrique. I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience too. And thanks a lot for also the other comments from the other participants. And if you have any comments, email Enrique, email us. Otherwise, we see everyone in the next webinar. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.